In the previous session, we talked about selection of statistical tests. We said that we need to understand if we require correlation or difference between the groups. We focused on tests of group differences. In the previous session, we talked about t-tests. In fact, in the previous section, we discussed t-tests which enable researchers to compare performance on two groups. And we said that we have two types of t-tests. Independent samples t-test when we have two independent groups, and paired samples t-test when we have students in the same group and we want to see the difference between the performance of the same students. Today, we will talk about other types of tests of group differences. ANOVA, analysis of variance. Many research designs require comparisons with more than two groups, and ANOVA may be appropriate in this context. A logical extension of a t-test is the case where you have more than two groups, that is, you have more than two means. In this situation, ANOVA is used when you want to test whether the scores of the three or more groups differ statistically. ANOVA will test the probability that the groups are different from each other. Attributes of ANOVA. It has exactly two variables. One variable is categorical with three or more levels, and it is the independent variable. The other variable is continuous, and it is the dependent variable. Considering the means, you would have three or more averages or means. The non-parametric alternative for ANOVA is Kruskal-Wallis test. If you are dealing with individuals, you are likely to encounter this situation using two different types of study designs. In this slide, I will explain the first design, and in the following slide, I will talk about the second study design. Here, in this design, in fact, you recruit a group of individuals and then randomly split this group into three or more smaller groups. That is, each participant is assigned to one and only one group. You then get each group to undertake different tasks. That is, you give them different tasks, or you put them in, let's say, different conditions, and then measure the outcome on the same dependent variable. If you look at this figure, you see that we have the same participant. We have participants, initial group of participants. Then we assign them into three different groups, three different conditions, X, Y, Z, or three treatment groups. The fact is that we will test all of these three groups with the same dependent variable measurement, for example, with the same post-test. For example, a researcher wishes to know whether different, for example, teaching strategies affect students' vocabulary knowledge. The researcher randomly assigns a group of volunteers to either of these groups. For example, traditional strategy training, new strategy training group, and the control group. And at the end, after the treatments, we will administer a post-test on vocabulary knowledge, all of the groups. Here we use an analysis of variance or ANOVA. A second study design is to recruit a group of individuals and then split them into groups based on some independent variable. Again, each individual will be assigned to one group only. If you look at the picture, you can see that we have initial group of participants and we assign them to different groups, to 3 different groups. This independent variable is sometimes called an attribute independent variable because you are splitting the group based on some attribute that they possess. For example, proficiency level. Each group is then measured on the same dependent variable having undergone the same task or the same condition or none at all. For example, a researcher is interested in determining whether there are differences between the vocabulary knowledge of students in 3 levels or in 3 different proficiency levels: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. We assign them to the 3 groups: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Then we run, for example, a vocabulary test. This is the same dependent variable measurement. And we run an ANOVA. We want to see if there is any significant difference between students' vocabulary knowledge level and their proficiency level. That is, for example, who is better with regard to vocabulary knowledge: advanced students, intermediate students, or beginners. In fact, this is just an example. The result is obvious. It is obvious that advanced students have higher levels of vocabulary knowledge. This type of study design is illustrated schematically in this figure for you. Here is an example. Research question: do learners in EFL or ESL contexts display differences in their recognition and rating of pragmatic and grammatical errors? The third group tested were native speakers of English. In fact, it examines whether the 3 groups perform differently on correctly identifying pragmatic and syntactic violations. Here, if you pay attention to the research question, you can see that we are dealing with EFL or ESL learners. Then we want to investigate difference in recognition of pragmatic and grammatical errors. And we have another group, another third group being tested, native speakers. So we have 2 groups in recognition and rating of pragmatic and grammatical errors: recognition group, rating group, and a third group is the native speaker. And here we want to examine whether these groups perform differently on correctly identifying pragmatic and syntactic violations or not. Can they in fact correctly identify these errors or not? Another example for ANOVA. You have conducted a study in which you are comparing the difference of 3 proficiency groups: beginners, intermediate, and advanced, regarding task completion time. Here is the descriptive statistics for this example. you are confident that the assumptions of a parametric test have been met, and you want to compare the results. Here you need to conduct an ANOVA to see if group differences are due to chance or are sufficient to reject the null hypothesis. If you look at the descriptive statistics table, the third column, mean, you can see that the mean score for beginners is 27, intermediate 23, and advanced again 23.4. Now we need to go to the ANOVA table. This table shows the results of ANOVA. An ANOVA provides information on whether or not the three or more groups differ, but it provides no information as to the location or the source of the difference. Here, if you look at the last column, sig, you see that it is below 0.5. Therefore, it shows that there is a significant difference between the three groups, beginners, intermediate, and advanced learners. But it does not show where the location of this difference is. That is, it does not tell us if the difference is between beginners and intermediate students, between intermediate and advanced, or between beginners and advanced. It just tells us that there is a significant difference somewhere between these. So we in fact need another test to find this kind of information. To do so, when the F value is significant, like in this table, a post hoc analysis is required. We have different post hoc tests, for example, 2K, Sheffey, and Duncan's multiple range test. This is an example of a multiple comparison table. In fact, here I gave you an example of a 2K post hoc table. From the results so far, we know that there are statistically significant differences between the groups as a whole. This table, in fact, multiple comparisons, shows which groups differed from each other. The 2K post hoc test is generally the preferred test for conducting post hoc tests on a one-way ANOVA, but there are many others, as I said. We can see from the table below that there is a statistically significant difference in time to complete the problem between the group that took the beginner course and the intermediate course. If you look at the sig column, you can see that the p-value equals 0.046, which is below 0.05. And also beginner and advanced, again sig equals 0.034, and intermediate and advanced, row number 4, is 0.989. Here the difference between intermediate and advanced is not significant because the sig is higher than 0.05. If you want to report the results of this table, we should report it like this. You can just read this output written below this table. There was a statistically significant difference between groups as determined by one-way ANOVA, and you give these info in parentheses. A 2K post hoc test revealed that the time to complete the task was significantly lower for the intermediate and advanced groups compared to the beginners group. There was no statistically significant difference between the intermediate and advanced groups. This is how you are supposed to report the results you obtain in a table, a 2K test table like this. Another type of ANOVA is called Factorial ANOVA. In second language research, there is often a need to consider two independent variables or more than two independent variables. For example, instructional type and proficiency level at the same time. Here you can use a factorial ANOVA. A factorial ANOVA expands from t-test and one-way ANOVA by including more than one independent variable. So if there are two independent variables, we conduct a two-way ANOVA. If there are three independent variables, it is a three-way ANOVA. Each independent variable can have two or more levels. A study which had the independent variable of gender, for example, there are two levels, male and female, and experimental conditions, three levels, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, could be called a 2x3 ANOVA. That is, we have two independent variables, the first of which has two levels, 2, and the second 3, 2x3 ANOVA. One advantage of a factorial ANOVA over a simple t-test or one-way ANOVA is that you can also investigate the interaction between factors. For example, it may be the case that males respond better to treatment A while females respond better to treatment B. This is the interaction effect. Attributes of factorial ANOVA. It has more than two variables. Two or more variables are categorical and they are independent variables. Exactly one variable is continuous and it is the dependent variable. As you can see, it is just like it was the case for ANOVA. We only need one dependent variable here. But the difference is in the number of independent variables. Here we have more than one independent variable. There is no non-parametric alternative to a factorial ANOVA, but one could test the influence of each independent variable separately using the non-parametric Kruskal-Wallis test. You would not get any information about the interaction between the variables, however. So if you had to use for the non-parametric equivalent, the only thing you can do is to use, for example, if you have two independent variables, you can conduct two Kruskal-Wallis tests. But the problem is that you cannot investigate the interaction between the independent variables here. Here is an example. Do groups of readers who differ in their reading proficiency perform differently depending on whether they are guessing the meaning or pronunciation of unknown words, and also depending on whether they see the words in context or in isolation? So here, as you can see, it examines whether groups performed differently when the variables of task, guessing meaning or pronunciation, and context, words in isolation versus words in context, are taken into account, and whether task, context, and reading proficiency interact. In other words, here we need a three-way ANOVA. Why? Because we have three independent variables. One variable is task, that is guessing meaning and pronunciation. The other variable is context with two layers again, isolation and a word in isolation and a word in context. And the other variable is proficiency level. So we need a three-way ANOVA in order to investigate this research question. As I said before, when there is more than one independent variable, the results will show main effects and an interaction effect, which is the effect of one dependent variable that is dependent on the other independent variable. In this figure, we can see that there is not a straightforward relationship between test scores and instruction type. Rather, there is an interaction between instruction type and proficiency level, such that the high proficiency students do better with instruction type 1, whereas low proficiency students perform better with instruction type 3. This is interaction. When the two lines in this figure, they in fact cut each other, we have a kind of interaction. Here, the interaction is that high proficiency students do better on one of the instructions, whereas low proficiency students perform better on the other type of instruction. Here we have an interaction between instruction type and proficiency level. The actual result of a two-way ANOVA is shown in tests of between subjects effects table, as shown here. The particular rows we are interested in are here in this example: gender, EDU level, and gender star EDU level rows. And these are highlighted. These rows inform us whether our independent variables, that is gender and educational level rows, and their interaction, gender star educational level rows, have a statistically significant effect on the dependent variable. The only thing you should do is to look at the last column, SIG. And then here you see that the main effect of gender was not significant because the SIG is in fact higher than 0.05. But the other two, that is the main effect of educational level and the interaction between gender and educational level, was significant. Repeated measures ANOVA. And this test is used for data in which the same participants are tested at more than one time and are tested repeatedly. In fact, repeated measures ANOVA is like paired samples t-test, but when we have more than two sets of scores. This design is used when the same participants are measured more than once. The repeated measurement may be separated by time, as for example these situations are: pre-test, post-test, and a delayed post-test, proficiency levels measured after 1 month, 6 months, and 1 year living in US. These are the two situations. In fact, these are examples. We cannot assume the independence of scores in the design because the same people were tested more than once. When we have pre-test, post-test, delayed post-test, in fact, we are testing the same students in 3 different time points. We cannot assume the independence of scores in this design. attributes of repeated measures ANOVA. It has more than two variables. Two or more variables are categorical and they are independent variables. In fact, here in repeated measures ANOVA, we need at least one independent variable, which is within group, meaning the same people are tested more than once and are in more than one of the groups. At least one independent variable is between groups, meaning this variable splits people so each is found in only one group. One variable is continuous and it is the dependent variable. Note, there is no non-parametric alternative to a repeated measures ANOVA. We can analyze data using a repeated measures ANOVA for two types of study designs. Studies that investigate either changes in mean scores over 3 or more time points, or second type, study designs that investigate either differences in mean scores under 3 or more different conditions. In this slide, I show you one study design, and in the following slide, the next design. For example, you might be investigating the effect of a 6 months exercise training program on a dependent variable and want to measure, for example, this dependent variable, something like blood pressure in this example, at 3 separate time points: pre-test, post-test, and delayed post-test, which would allow you to develop a time course for any exercise effect. If you pay attention here, we have the same participants being tested 3 times. Therefore, we can use repeated measures ANOVA. For the second design, you might get the same students or the same participants to eat different types of cake. In this example, you can see that we have chocolate, caramel, and lemon. And then rate each one for taste rather than having different people flavor each different cake. The important point with these two study designs, that is this design and the one I mentioned in the previous slide, is that the same people are being measured more than once on the same dependent variable. This is why it is called repeated measures ANOVA. Where measurements are made under different conditions, like in this example, the conditions are the levels or related groups are of the independent variable. For example, type of cake is the independent variable here with 3 layers: chocolate, caramel, and lemon. If I want to give another example related to language teaching, you can consider 3 conditions: pre-task planning, post-task planning, and online planning. I can ask the same participants to encounter these 3 conditions, and then at the end I measure them with the same. For example, if the task was a writing one, I test them with the same writing task, and I run a repeated measures ANOVA to see which treatment was more useful: online planning, pre-task planning or post-task planning, but the fact is that the participants were the same, so I used repeated measures ANOVA. MANOVA, multivariate analysis of variance. MANOVA differs from an ANOVA in that it has more than one dependent variable. In order to appropriately use a MANOVA, there has to be justification for believing that the dependent variables are related to one another. Look at this example. You have conducted a study of the effectiveness of 3 different planning conditions on learners' speaking performance as measured by CAF: complexity, fluency, and accuracy. Here, complexity, fluency, and accuracy can be considered as 3 related dependent variables because all of them are different aspects of speaking performance in this example. So here we have 3 dependent variables. In fact, we have 3 different measures for speaking ability. This is what we mean by related dependent variables. Here is a picture that illustrates the condition in which you can use MANOVA. As you can see, we have initial group of participants. We assigned them into 3 different treatment or condition groups, and therefore we have different participants in the 3 groups, and we have more than 2 groups, and more than one dependent variable, for example, complexity, fluency, and accuracy. Remember that MANOVA is part of the family of analysis of variance. MANOVA is simply an ANOVA with several dependent variables. That is to say, ANOVA tests for the difference in means between 2 or 3 groups, while MANOVA tests for the difference in 2 or more vectors of the means. Here it is just like the condition in which we run 3 ANOVAs. For example, 1 ANOVA for complexity, 1 ANOVA for fluency, and 1 ANOVA for accuracy. But it's better to use MANOVA because in one analysis you can in fact do something like 3 ANOVAs. Analysis of covariance or ANCOVA. There are times when there might be a pre-existing difference among groups, and the variable where that difference is manifested is related to the dependent variable. The pre-existing difference will need to be controlled for and is referred to as the covariate. Because of the differences among groups, the post-test results will need to be adjusted. So here we have pre-test, we have post-test, and we have more than one group. In this case, we can use ANCOVA, but the fact is that ANCOVA helps us to alleviate any pre-existing difference in the pretest. Assume that we have 2 groups, group 1 and group 2. For group 1, we have pretest, treatment, and then post-test. For group 2, we have pretest, treatment 2, and the post-test. Here, ANCOVA can be used when you have a two-group pre-test, post-test design. For example, comparing the impact of two different interventions, taking before and after measures for each group. These scores on the pre-test are treated as a covariate to control for pre-existing differences between the groups. If you remember, we talked about this design previously. It is a two-group pre-test, post-test design. When we want to investigate the results, we can simply use ANOVA. We covariate the pre-tests, that is, we adjust the pre-tests, we adjust the pre-existing differences between the two groups, and then with adjusted pre-tests, we compare the post-tests. This is what an ANCOVA does. So today we discussed the remaining tests of difference. First was analysis of variance, or ANOVA. Then Factorial ANOVA, for example, Twoway Anova, Threeway Anova. Then repeated measures ANOVA, which, as I said, is just like paired samples t-test, but here we have more than two sets of scores. We have three sets of scores. Then we use repeated measures ANOVA in this situation. Then multivariate analysis of variance, or MANOVA, when we have more than one dependent variable. And finally, analysis of covariance, or ANCOVA, when there is a pre-existing difference among the groups in the pre-test. We use ANCOVA. This is the end of session 13. Good luck.